Okay, hi everybody. Imogen and I are back this week to have a little chat all about using functional movements to help improve general mobility, but also to dispel some of those general aches and pains that we all feel, particularly as we get older, through hips, knees, ankles, shoulders, lots of different kind of joints that feel like they become a bit more stiff and a bit more restricted in terms of perhaps their range of motion. And so we're going to be talking about the different ways, depending on who you are, what your lifestyle is like, how you can kind of help feel a bit more flexible, a bit more mobile, and try to reduce those aches and pains that you might be feeling that are very common with our clients. So welcome, Imogen, first of all.
Hello.
So we've talked about this kind of thing a little bit before, particularly when we picked on certain areas like shoulders, for example, and neck. We've talked about quite a bit, and how to reduce aches and pains, or reduce tightness and contraction of muscles that we feel by sitting in set positions, for example, for long periods of time. But what we're really talking about today is movements that can be used for set exercises. So let's say, you might do a yoga class or a Pilates class or strength training even, but how we translate some of those movements into just what we should be using on an everyday basis, rather than just a set period of time where we go to do a class, or we've got our own strength training session going on, or workout of any kind, or even a set mobility session that we're trying to do, whether it's at home or in the gym, but actually taking some of those basic movements, what we call more functional movements, that we should be using on an everyday basis around our home, perhaps when we're at work, when we're out and about, and just making sure that we're A, doing them correctly, but B, that they don't have to just be something that becomes a part of a session that you have to dedicate a long amount of time to. We can do some of these things that we're going to be talking about today just 30 seconds at a time, at various points throughout your day, but consistency with movement and diversity of movement is absolutely key. So I'm going to get started just by saying, some of the things which my, things that pop up with my clients really on a regular basis, the things that they might be complaining about, or things that they've got concerns around, aches and pains. And then I know, Imogen, you come across lots of similar things, but perhaps different examples. And then how we will give advice to our clients, the kind of things that we would be telling them to do to help negate some of these issues. So for me, and I'll give some very classic examples. Obviously, lots of people have aches and pains. We've talked about lower back pain before, but it is really common. And in fact, I've just been with a client just now who has been experiencing this. A lot of the time, obviously, yes, sedentary jobs, sitting at a desk, sitting in set positions, shoulders rolled forward, backs either kind of in a little bit of flexion, so they're kind of bent over a little bit as well. Staying in those set positions for long periods of time is obviously not great. Now, before, we've talked about doing things like spinal releases, so that can be through kind of rotational movements. It can be through full-on flexion, where you really bend over forwards to release and decompress that spine, or it could be through extension, where you pull those shoulders back, little bit more of a bend in the lumbar spine to kind of release there. And also we've got our lateral side to side movements, where we might reach down, because our spine can move in all these different ways. But when it comes to kind of other things which don't just feel like maybe a stretch, or taking muscles out of contraction, we talk about exercises which are going to kind of protect our back as such, by making sure that the spine doesn't move once it becomes under load with movement. So when you're adding movement, so let's say, you're kind of trying to keep your spine in a set position. Now, that set position, though, I always work obviously with strength training, so I'm thinking about things like squats and lunges and deadlifts and things like that, and trying to make sure that people maintain the position of their back once they start moving, if it's under load in particular. So it doesn't always have to be, lots of people think it has to be, you have to have a totally straight back. Obviously, we talk about these kind of movements with hinging from the hip, pushing your hips backwards to make sure that you can do that, and you're engaging all the right kinds of muscles. But really what you could also do if you were moving under load, even if it's just your body weight, is actually you could get a little set position where back could be slightly rounded. But as long as you set that position and then that spine doesn't move out of that position, doesn't flex and extend out of a very small degree of movement whilst you're doing that under load, once you actually start moving and you're bracing to stop that happening, then that isn't going to cause too much of an issue. It's when we kind of move under load and where we're kind of flexing and extending our back out of a very small kind of range of motion, that's where we have the shearing forces that cause that kind of pain in our lower back. Often the kind of L4, L5 lumbar region is very common. Now, with doing that, obviously not everyone's going to be kind of full on strength training, putting lots of weight. Often it's just our body weight. But what we tend to do is, instead of using those movements and using things like bracing our core a little bit and actually using a squat position or a lunge position to get down, we're bending our back over to perhaps pick something up. A classic example was a client of mine who just went to pick up a stick off of the grass as they were tidying up their garden. Again, not heavy weight, but again, it was the movement of perhaps doing that kind of thing regularly, not bracing, moving their spine out of position as they were moving up and down, probably not bending their knees enough, that kind of thing. Yeah, causing that kind of real lower back pain. But I try to make sure that people really understand how to do a squat properly, first of all, perhaps how to lunge down properly, make sure you've got the technique of doing those, and then using it for your everyday things that you do. So anything you might be picking up off of the floor, or obviously kind of putting down onto the floor, making sure you're using a squat type movement or a lunge type movement to get down to the ground, and just making sure that you're also just moving in a diversity of various different ways, not just always perhaps doing a squat or a lunge. There's lots of different ways that you can kind of move, and moving body up and down in terms of height, but also kind of side to side laterally as well. So I think it's really important to think about those two things, thinking about protecting areas that you're really struggling with, using joints the way they're supposed to be used, like the pushing the hips back, hinging from the hip, rather than just using your back to bend over, things like that, and actually bending your knees. Now, lots of people I find, I don't know if you have the same, Imogen, but anyone who has kind of knee issues often are, very restrictive in terms of what they're willing to try in terms of using their knees. And actually what that tends to do is just makes it worse over time. They are stiffening up ligaments, tendons, not obviously using the muscles they should be using in a movement where you do need to bend your knees to get lower, for example. And those are just weakening everything all way round, really. That doesn't help things. And also, the less you use your knees, you tend to produce less synovial fluid, which is around obviously your patella area, and so it is a bit like kind of use it or lose it. Now, obviously, if you've had surgery or if you had really bad injuries where something in terms of the structure of the knee has changed, then yes, of course, there's adjustments that need to be made for that. But with most people, it is just a case of they just haven't been mobile with it. They haven't used it enough. They're not increasing the load of those tendons or those ligaments for your body to naturally start making adjustments and use them for these types of movements. So yeah, I mean, what are the kinds of things, the niggles and the pains and things that you find are coming to you, and perhaps the reasons why they might need to be changing the way in which they move?
It's similar to you, like you say, it's similar. Quite often it will be, like you say, back's quite a common, or hips I've seen quite a bit recently, I suppose. And then obviously neck and shoulders are quite a common area from either long periods working at a desk, a lot of sitting, a lot of driving seems to be, long periods of driving seems to be things that causing issues to people. And it, like I say, it's the time of periods where you either aren't able to change position, so you can't change position if you're on a long drive, like it's just not possible.
No.
Or if you're like obviously with work and stuff, if the commitments that are required for whatever it is you're doing mean that you just can't be absent and moving around like in the movements and stuff like we've said about. They tend to be the reasons why people sort of struggle. And then like in terms of sort of the recommendations, like you were sort of saying, of like the fact that it's important, like we go on about it a lot with having the variety is important, but it's like one of the, if you can be varied in the positions and stuff that you're doing and finding those movements and stuff, it helps give that resilience because it gives you more options. So if something is becoming sort of uncomfortable or painful, then you can move through different ranges as well. So you can keep active. So then it does stop you being sort of this point where you're like, I can't do anything. So it kind of helps from the kind of keeping mobility there. And so I quite often, if people find a certain position, so like using that sort of like quite either the bending forward, or quite often with backs and stuff, if it's if you've already bent forward and then they're coming back up to stand, like people can be quite conscious of that as a movement, because you're having to sort of bring yourself through. There is an element of the bracing and stuff like this, but there's ways you can move through these ranges without having to do that, or you can modify it and take other stretches. So like you can come through more from like the side and come up in more of like a sideways and side bend and things like this. And then sort of on the flip, if it's obviously trying to prevent sort of the niggles and stuff rather than necessarily dealing with the once you've actually got the pain, like you say, it's finding and taking movements that you would do. And I quite often find with like, if people are in the gym and stuff, like it's the things that you would often do as either like activation drills and stuff that you're usually having to think about. So like if you were taking us when you've been sat on the sofa or sat at your desk, a lot of us will lean forward to come up to stand, where it's like, where actually the position you're in is essentially a squat position. So it's using that sort of activation to help push yourself up, but without having to necessarily put so much on the arms. So you're getting a bit of glute and leg strengthening. Or for those that are like, one I quite often use with people is recommending like the use of the dead time, because I was saying to you before, wasn't I, with in the kit, like if people in the kitchen and you're having making a cup of tea, or making for the microwave or something like this, like you've got counter surfaces around, so you can take positions and the stretches that you would potentially do in like yoga. So for example, like your your puppy pose, or maybe even your child pose, depending on the movement and how you're sort of angling your position of the legs, because you can rest your arms on the counters.
I love doing that one, Imogen. It's my favourite. It's my favourite.
Mine too.
And with hands on a higher surface. So child's pose often, like in yoga, might be done on a mat on the floor, and you're stretching your arms out in front, pushing your bum back towards your heels and really stretching your body out. But what I absolutely love, because it gives a little bit of extra resistance and you really feel that through the kind of stretch in the back, is if you've got your hands on a higher surface, so you're standing instead, you can bend your knees, push your bottom still back just like you would in a child's pose, but you've got your arms stretched out on a higher surface where your head can then drop like a dead weight between your arms, and you just allow yourself time to sink into that position. That is, for me, just one of the best stretches that I just do. I pretty much do it definitely every day, sometimes once a day. And a bit like you know, I use that in my dead time. Now for me, my dead time tends to be that kind of rest time. I know I've mentioned it before in other sessions in the gym, so between kind of sets, where I'm doing, you know, I've got that, it is technically supposed to be rest time, but what I'm doing is I'm not necessarily stretching the same area that I'm actually working at. That, you know, I might be doing a leg day, but I'm actually using that child's pose type stretch to stretch my upper body and to keep things mobile. I'll do, you know, kind of shoulder rolls, I'll do my W stretch and squeeze everything back. So I just use my dead time to get loads of mobility working, and actually I've been doing that loads this week, and I just feel so much looser. I just feel, you know, I haven't got any aches and pains through my muscles, not just through kind of like DOMs, through actual training, but just in general. I don't feel things are kind of contracted and tight. I'm just constantly kind of keeping things moving, but I don't do it for really long periods of time. I know we've said this before, it doesn't take a whole session to do mobility work, to do kind of stretching where it's just kind of loosening off the areas where you get the most tight or you feel your aches and pains the most. it can just be 30 seconds max sometimes at a
Well, you
time.
just sometimes, I mean, in some instances, you don't even need to time it, do you?
No,
Like, it's one of those where it's like, it forget about the time
yeah,
and just focus on the movement. Because if
yeah,
you get in that, it's more about the habit of doing it. Because if you
yes,
build the
yeah,
habit of it, then you know you'll automatically get the accumulation of the frequency of it, because you'll just do it every time you do it.
exactly.
So it's one of those where it's like, it doesn't matter how long you do. I mean, it could be a 2 seconds, but if as long as you're sort of going through that motion of building that behavior in it, the rest will follow.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's what I say. It's absolutely, consistent. We know this phrase with so many things, whether it's nutrition, whether it's exercise, mobility. Consistency is key. But unlike kind of going, as I say, to the gym to do a set, workout or whatever it might be, this can just be little and often becoming part of a healthy lifestyle habit that we just do naturally. Now, obviously, when you're not used to doing this, yes, it takes a bit of kind of mindfulness to think, right, okay, I'm not doing anything now. I just need to kind of do some of those basic movements, those basic stretches. And what I say to people is, you don't have to do or remember exactly what all those stretches look like, feel like, etc., etc. They don't have to be perfect. Essentially, if you go into a stretch position and you feel good and you feel like, oh, that's releasing something, or it's giving me a really good stretch, or oh, my back feels so kind of like, released by doing this particular movement, just play around with movement. It really doesn't kind of have to be a set position, and it can be dynamic. It doesn't have to be static. You don't have to just, like I was showing that kind of W stretch. I like that one, and I'm squeezing back and I really get a good release, but then I love kind of coming out of it and then going back into it. Similarly with that child's pose one, I will kind of move relatively quickly between getting into that pose, feeling that good stretch, and then moving back out of it into a different way. Sometimes, again, if I'm just hanging around in the gym in my rest time between sets, I'll just grab onto one of the kind of hand holds anywhere on one of the kind of benches. It could be anything that's there. And I just literally twist my body, move my body in different ways. I don't do it too fast. And I think that is one of the things that people get. And I know you have that sometimes with people with neck issues and things like that, where they've kind of put a crick in their neck because they've twisted too fast doing a particular movement. When something, you've got muscles contracted, then that's where we're going to get those issues of nerve trapping and things like that. But, do it slowly and carefully, but just move in a variety of different ways. It doesn't have to be a set position, just whatever feels good, and just play around with it. Move different joints in different ways. Move your hips to the side, move them back, move them forwards, rotate through the hips. Same with things like shoulders and ankles and things like that. Just the more mobility in terms of the types of movements, the diversity of movements that you can give your body, the better. And you're just going to feel so much more, you're going to help to loosen off muscles, tendons, ligaments, all of those things at the same time. But you're going to get to know your body a lot better as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I was going to say with it though, is it's not you can play with some of the strength stuff as well, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
yes, it might not necessarily be like obviously with building strength with weight per se, but it's more about the control or the proprioceptive stuff. So like you were saying, of where moving around and stuff and doing it slowly. So for example, one I quite often do, because I have to sort of with the glute activation to make sure that I'm sort of working on that, and also from still continued rehab from the ankle, essentially is that sort of balancing on one leg. Now sometimes if I'm doing it, I will do it just to try and stand on one leg, and I might have eyes closed and stuff, so it is a little bit more static. But other times it may be like, and I know I've sold a few people I've had before where it's like playing around with either moving the leg and letting my other leg swing around, so you're getting a little bit of off balance and having to control it. Or it might be, I call it running man, so where you're bringing the sort of the knee up to the chest or letting it come behind, so you're getting a bit of hip hinging, and only gentle movement. Like I'm not going full ranges in any of this, it's just to get that slight hip hinging, so you're slightly getting that activation. But if you're playing around with this type of thing, you're still going to be working some form of like that control element of strength. And likewise, obviously, like you were saying with the W and stuff, by doing that slow movement, you're still getting that control of the shoulder activation and things. And you can play with what position it is. So I often find, well, I don't know about you with clients and stuff, that they find it easier to fit mobility in,
Yeah,
because it's quite easy to think of the stretches to
yeah,
do, like we're saying, and fit this all in. But then strength is one of these that it's like, well, I haven't got time to do squats, and it's like, well, you don't really need to. Like, you can take the same approach that you do with the mobility, but apply it to the movements that you can do with strength. Because likewise, if you're feeling something work, you can feel something contracting, something having to work to control, then you know you're targeting the muscle that you need to. And if it's tiring quite quickly and stuff, and you can feel that benefit when you're doing it, then you probably are onto something good.
yeah.
Would be
Absolutely.
what I
And
say.
yeah, I think that is an important point to make. Everybody is unique. I know we've talked about this before in other chats as well. And not everybody feels the same stretch in the same way. Not everybody kind of can activate the muscles in the same way as other people can. Some people are kind of better at, glutes are a great example. Some people really struggle to activate their glutes. They don't know how to do it, or they think that they're using their glutes for a particular exercise, but actually they're using lower back muscles because they don't have the strength in their glutes to help them with the movement, particularly when you go into what you were saying, kind of single leg exercises where there is a bit more proprioception going on. There's a bit more, you really need to have a really good mind muscle and mind movement connection between certain movements that are single leg in particular. And people who don't know how to kind of do that really do struggle. So it's getting to know your body, what kind of movements you do which are going to really activate certain muscles so that you can build them, use them better, and that's going to be obviously really helpful for some of these functional movements around the home that you can do without even having to think about then activating those muscles. So once you actually know how they should feel when you move in different ways, that's really important. So it's getting to know your body and trying different things, different stretches, different exercises, where are actually going to kind of activate those muscles. I know that I'm the same with my hamstrings. There's certain exercises or machines I might use in the gym where I'm really just not getting the activation doing it in this way. But I know the way, I've tested out different machines, different exercises, free weight exercises as well, even just body weight exercises that I know actually are going to activate my hamstrings the best. And that is how I'm going to kind of build them, think about them, use them in other everyday functional movements as well. And I think as soon as you know how they feel and know how you should use them, it becomes less of something you have to really think about in the everyday, when you're doing these things. I know that I've worked with clients on this, particularly people like runners, where they have not been using even some big muscle groups, again, often the glutes, glute medius in particular, as that kind of prime mover, but also a stabilizer between hip and knee movement. As soon as they build up a bit of muscle or build that mind muscle connection and know how to use it, as soon as they start to go running again, they cannot believe the difference that it's making in terms of kind of how strong they feel when they're running, because they're activating more muscles and muscles that they should have been perhaps activating and using a little bit more, but also when those people have been using other muscle groups to compensate for the lack of perhaps strength or just the lack of mind muscle connection or mind movement connection with those areas, and then taking away from other prime movers and actually reducing things like knee pain or ankle issues or hip pain, that kind of thing. So it has such a kind of being able to do these things, learn more about functional movements, how to do them all the time so that you're building muscle in general. And movement, and obviously kind of all those things we said about just feeling better, having general less aches and pains, but you're going to kind of hopefully have a myriad of other kind of benefits through doing these functional movements, even if it's without weight, you're just using your body weight as much as possible. And a lot of the time those functional movements are all the main ones. You can kind of narrow it down, if you like, to several things like squatting down, lunging down to do your up and down movements to get down rather than bending over, and that can be in a variety of different ways. There's lots of different squats. You can go wide leg squat, you can go more narrow in your squat, you can do one foot fully flat on the floor and one kind of not so much to get as low as you possibly can, but you're still bending those knees, using those ankles for ankle mobility, but also, like you said, lots of the single leg stuff is really, really good for building particularly muscles that just become so weak when we don't do any single leg work. And as I say, it does not have to be you know, with weight. Body weight is, I know really good athletes strong athletes, people who are gym goers, they're lifters or they're triathletes, and they just can't do single leg work with weight. It has to be body weight because they're just used to just using their prime movers so much. So yeah, highly recommend what you said, and do a lot more kind of proprioceptive work, particularly for mobility as well. That's going to just, yeah, generally help overall.
Yeah, for sure. Like I say, my thing is just have a play, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
just have a play and don't be afraid.
no, don't be afraid to just kind of play and be literally be playful, you know, with your movements. Don't, you know, a bit like going into the gym for time, try not to worry what you look like, you know, just play around with movement. I've really gone past that stage a very long time ago, and I'm sure people look at me funny in the gym, but I just feel so good for doing these, you know, all these different types of movements in different ways. Whatever feels good to me, I'm stretching it out. I am kind of moving my joints as much as I can, biggest range of motion wherever I can. So yeah, highly recommend that you just get creative with your movement. Try and keep it diverse, but as I said, consistency is key. Little and often. It doesn't have to be a full-on session, just whenever you fancy a little stretch, but ideally just regularly throughout your day. Little bits will really help you out with those aches and pains. Okay, right. Lovely to chat to you again, Imogen. We'll
Thank
catch up
you.
next time on our next topic, and thank you everybody else for joining us. We'll see you soon.